My ex-wife cheated and left us 15 years ago. Now she's back with her lover to take custody of my daughter. Today, I'm reposting it using a throwaway account. It feels like a necessary step toward catharsis. After all, last week marked yet another court date for the woman I've come to call the ex-beauty queen stalk. Predictably, the hearing didn't result in a resolution. We were expecting a plea, guilty or not guilty, but instead, we were served another vague excuse about her unreadiness to proceed. The court issued yet another postponement, this time setting a new date months away. This has become an exhausting pattern, stretching on for over 18 months since her initial arrest for stalking and harassment. It's painfully evident that she's dragging this process out, seemingly as a means to stay relevant in our lives. And let me just add, the amount of public resources and taxpayer money being drained by this circus is truly staggering. Now let's rewind to the beginning of this ordeal. Before my husband and I met, he had been in a relationship with a beauty, an actual title holder from a prestigious pageant. Their relationship ended long before I came into the picture. By anyone's standards, she was a striking woman. Tall, blonde, and statuesque. She had that polished, magazine cover appearance that turned heads wherever she went. It's important to the story, I suppose, that I acknowledge her beauty, but what lay beneath the surface of her dazzling exterior was a far cry from what you'd expect. While she could be charming when she needed to be, especially when it benefited her, she generally treated those around her with contempt and disregard. My husband was no exception. Eventually, her behavior became too much for him to tolerate, and he ended the relationship. But she never truly went away. After their breakup, she continued to insert herself into his life through persistent calls and email. When he and I started dating, her attempts to contact him didn't just continue, they escalated. She would call incessantly, day and night, even after he blocked her number. Her demands alternated between financial extortion, threatening to falsely accuse him of abuse if he didn't give her money, and sugary pleas for his assistance with various projects she claimed to be working on. These projects, of course, were merely ploys to exploit his skills and labor while she took the credit. Each time, she promised that if he helped her just this once, she'd leave him alone for good. He never responded, and her demeanor would shift rapidly from manipulative sweetness to venomous threats. Any means of gaining attention, or more specifically, money, was fair game in her eyes. My husband was genuinely afraid of the potential consequences. While he had done nothing wrong, the mere suggestion of her accusations carried the power to damage his reputation and career irreparably. It was a dark cloud that hung over us. The first time I encountered her in person was at a social event we both happened to attend. Unbeknownst to us, she had positioned herself strategically near the venue's entrance, lying in wait. As we walked in, I could feel her eyes boring into us from across the room. She openly scrutinized me, whispering and laughing with her date in a manner clearly designed to make me feel uncomfortable. While her attempts to unnerve me were annoying, they were ultimately easy to ignore. That is, until she ambushed me on my way out of the restroom. She must have been watching and waiting for an opportunity to confront me alone. Standing nearly 6 feet tall and towering over my 5'5" frame, she hunched down to my eye level, her face twisted into an unsettling, maniacal grin. She moved alongside me as I tried to walk away, leaning in close and whispering, "Where is your man?" Her heavily accented voice had a sharp, taunting edge to it. Her black, narrowed eyes gleamed with something almost otherworldly, like a character ripped straight out of a Tim Burton movie. "Watch your back, pug," she sneered, adding the cruel nickname she had coined for me. Apparently because I own pugs and she thought it was an insult. At that moment, I had no idea that, while I was in the restroom, she had approached my husband and thrown her arm around him as he was engaged in a conversation. She had audaciously introduced herself to the person he was speaking with, pretending as if they were still a couple. My husband immediately disentangled himself from her grasp and told her to leave. Afterward, she made a beeline for me, hoping to unsettle me further. After that incident, we stopped attending events where there was even a slight chance of running into her. However, she managed to infiltrate another solemn occasion, a funeral for a mutual friend. At the wake, she followed me around relentlessly. My husband was speaking with the widow while I was in a separate conversation with another couple. Out of nowhere, she joined our small group, inserting herself into the conversation as though she belonged. Her presence was bizarre and deeply unnerving. I quietly excused myself, picking up my wine glass and walking away without a word. As I glanced back, I saw her smirking at me, clearly reveling in her ability to disturb the peace. While her in-person antics were alarming, they paled in comparison to the relentless digital harassment that followed. She called my husband incessantly, day and night, from blocked and unknown numbers. She began driving by our house, and though I could never prove it, I strongly suspected her when I discovered my car had been keyed after being parked outside one night. Finally, my husband decided enough was enough and had a lawyer send her a cease and desist letter. Her reaction was nothing short of deranged. She called him from a private number and in a sing-song voice chirped, "It's me," as though they were old friends. He immediately hung up without a word. 2 more cease and desist letters followed, but they only seemed to escalate her anger and determination. She simply couldn't fathom that my husband was capable of moving on without her. In her mind, her beauty alone should have been enough to keep him tethered. When it became clear that he wasn't going to give in, she turned her rage toward the internet. Her first move was to create a fake Twitter account where she launched a smear campaign against him. She tweeted accusations, calling him a fraud and tagging his colleagues, friends, and family. On New Year's Eve, she posted a cryptic, mocking comment on my private Instagram account, writing, "Happy New Year's, Scrud," at precisely 12:01 a.m. It was chilling in its precision and malice. Social media settings were locked down tighter than ever. Armed with emails threatening extortion, we finally went to the police. She was arrested and charged with 2 counts of harassment. A restraining order was issued. We thought this might be the end of it, but instead it became front-page news. A surreal twist that felt almost too bizarre to be real. When her first court appearance arrived, we were stunned by her transformation. The once statuesque beauty queen was now unrecognizable. She had shaved her head and donned a ragged, ill-fitting wig. Her once trim figure had ballooned significantly, and she carried herself with a hunched, almost menacing posture. Clad in a bulky men's overcoat and a scarf tied over her wig, she resembled a caricature of her former self. Her eyes, which my young son had once described as mean, had grown darker and more sinister, narrowed into piercing black slits. During the hearing, she frequently turned to glare at us, whispering and laughing with her lawyer as though she found the whole ordeal amusing. Her demeanor was both unnerving and grotesque, a far cry from the composed, glamorous image she had once projected. It became clear that getting arrested hadn't diminished her resolve, it had only fueled her obsession. The restraining order didn't seem to deter her in the slightest. If anything, it acted as gasoline poured onto an already blazing inferno. It seemed as though the legal action not only failed to temper her behavior, but actually enraged her further. What followed was a period of unrelenting harassment that left me questioning how far someone could spiral when consumed by bitterness and obsession. Every single day, morning, noon, and night, she created fake social media accounts to bombard us with hate. Her activity was dizzying in its volume and sheer malevolence. From these accounts, she posted photos of me and my husband, often grotesquely altered to amplify her cruel intentions. For example, she took a professional photo of my husband and superimposed captions like pedophile or fraud across it. Some captions were so vile they included racist and transphobic slurs, dripping with venom and designed to shock anyone who saw them. Her posts didn't stop there. She began to manipulate images of my husband to mock his masculinity, photoshopping heavy makeup onto his face and captioning them with phrases like pre-op transgender, as if that was some kind of insult. She also turned her attention to me, uploading unflattering photos and calling me old or ugly. The mockery wasn't limited to these surface-level jabs. She dissected every perceived flaw with obsessive detail, posting hundreds of images with commentary meant to demean me. To say it was exhausting would be an understatement. I'd be lying if I said her comments didn't get to me occasionally. Seeing my face plastered all over her accounts, paired with such venomous commentary, wore me down at times. But that wasn't what kept me up at night. What terrified me most were the sinister undertones in her posts, the chilling hints that she was watching our every move. She would write cryptic captions like, "Keep an eye on your kids because I be watching," or "Why don't you plant some flowers in your front yard?" These comments might have sounded benign to an outsider, but to me, they were deeply unsettling because they hinted at her physical presence near our home. She also posted a haunting, seemingly innocuous question. "How was your Uber Eats order?" The idea that she might have been watching us as we went about our daily lives was enough to make my skin crawl. Her malice wasn't confined to veiled threats. She escalated into outright menacing imagery. She uploaded pictures of me with arrows pointing at my head, which I interpreted as implying a gunshot. She shared photos of my husband's workplace, a location she was explicitly forbidden from approaching under the restraining order. When we reported this to the police, they frustratingly dismissed it, saying the images could have been pulled from the internet rather than taken in person. And then there were the quotes. Always the quotes. She seemed to have an affinity for the dark musings of Agatha Christie, posting lines like, "Every killer is usually someone you know well," or "Your end is near." As if that wasn't unsettling enough, she chose a movie poster as her Twitter profile banner. The poster, ironically or perhaps intentionally, bore the single chilling word, "Stalker." Each of these posts came from one of her countless fake accounts, and the police told us their hands were tied. Since she didn't explicitly tag us in her posts, it wasn't considered direct harassment under their guidelines. I took screenshots of everything. My phone filled with thousands of images, documenting her unhinged behavior, each one more bizarre and threatening than the last. I was building a fortress of evidence, But in the meantime, I felt like my family and I were under siege. The harassment began to seep into our everyday lives in ways that were both dramatic and mundane. My kids couldn't even shoot hoops in the driveway without me feeling a knot of anxiety in my stomach. My elderly mother, who often helped care for our youngest, refused to take the baby out in the stroller, too frightened of what might happen. Normal life was no longer possible. Every small activity felt like a potential risk. Then there was the dog. Somehow, the idea of her owning a pet unsettled me more than anything else. In one of her grotesque attempts at mockery, she posted a close-up photo of her dog's genitals, accompanied by my name. In another post, she photographed a piece of dog excrement and wrote my name beside it. The implications were obvious and revolting. The fact that she cared for another living creature felt incongruous with everything else I knew about her, making the entire situation even more surreal. The calls to our landline started up again. Not the friendly sing-song, "Hey, it's me," from earlier in the saga, but dark and cryptic messages. She would whisper the word bitch before hanging up or chant ominously, as though reciting a spell. Her social media reflected this new fixation with the occult. She posted images of a pentagram surrounded by candles, captioning them with phrases like, "ring ring." Finally, after what felt like an eternity of torment, the police asked us to come in and provide formal video statements. My husband and I arrived armed with a USB drive containing thousands of screenshots of her social media posts. This mountain of evidence was undeniable, and the authorities arrested her again. This time, she faced 2 additional charges of criminal harassment. My husband was understandably furious, but I was operating in full mama bear mode. Her posts that referenced our children were the most upsetting of all. She called them names too vile to repeat, and the fact that her rage extended to our innocent kids made her actions feel even more heinous. In court, a judge imposed a new condition: a complete social media ban. Any online activity whatsoever would risk another arrest. By this point, she had posted over 16,000 tweets in a span of 3 months. She didn't even have followers. It was as though she were screaming into the void, a constant stream of vitriol meant only for us to find. When the accounts finally went silent, the absence of her madness was deafening. The peace that followed was tenuous. Though her Twitter tirades stopped, I remained on edge. The fear that she might still be watching lingered. Every time I received a follower request from an unfamiliar account, I suspected it might be her trying to sneak back into our lives. At night, even the simple act of walking into the kitchen for a late-night snack filled me with paranoia. I'd catch myself glancing nervously out the window, half expecting to see her silhouette in the shadows. Nothing is more dangerous than a desperate woman with nothing left to lose. Those words she had once posted herself, replayed in my mind whenever I felt a chill of unease. Her behavior went beyond anything I could rationally comprehend. Based on my research, I believe she fits the profile of a malignant narcissist, though it's possible other mental health issues were at play. Regardless, her cruelty wasn't new. She had been a terrible person long before she fixated on us. I later learned, through reliable sources, that she had become known to law enforcement for other reasons after her relationship with my husband ended. While he was fortunate to avoid her false accusations of abuse, other men she dated weren't so lucky. One of her social media posts stands out in my memory, not because it was the most shocking, but because it seemed to encapsulate her mindset. Translated from her native language, it read, "Update. To summarize, my husband once dated a beauty queen who was a title holder of a prestigious and well-known pageant. What seemed like a closed chapter in his life quickly became a nightmare once we started dating. She went nuclear, spiraling into a full-blown obsession, and it often felt like we were characters in a Stephen King novel. The fear and stress of living under her shadow consumed us for years, and while I imagine the knowledge of how deeply she affected our lives would bring her great satisfaction, I can finally say that we've moved past it, though the scars remain. Let me begin by saying that the court process was agonizingly slow. Legal proceedings have their own pace, and when you add the chaos of a global pandemic into the mix, that pace becomes even slower. From her initial arrest to the conclusion of this saga, years passed. During that time, she was required to live with an assurer. For those unfamiliar with the term, as I was, an assurer is someone who posts bail money and takes responsibility for the defendant while they're out on bail. In her case, the bail was somewhere between $1,000 and $5,000, and her initial assurer was her mother. However, after she was rearrested for violating the restraining order and continuing her harassment, the court ruled that her mother could no longer act as her assurer. She needed someone new. The pandemic shifted much of the court process online. Zoom hearings became the norm, adding an additional layer of surrealism to an already bizarre story. Several court dates came and went over the years, but most of these were procedural, attended only by her lawyer. Requests for deferrals, Procedural delays and pandemic-related slowdowns stretched the process interminably. The last significant hearing occurred in August of 2020. My curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to see her for myself, to know what she looked like after all this time. Closure, perhaps. Or maybe just confirmation that this nightmare was finally ending. When the virtual court session began, there she was, live on my screen. Gone was the ratty wig she had worn during her first court appearance. Her hair had grown back, short and pin straight, and she looked much the same as I remembered from her last in-person appearance. She hadn't lost any of the weight she'd gained, and she wore a peculiar white coat that reminded me of a lab coat. She had no makeup on, and her face appeared drained of the glamour and charisma she once wielded like a weapon. Her behavior during the Zoom session was erratic and disorganized. She struggled to get her camera in focus, repeatedly disappearing from view despite the judge's insistence that she remain visible during the proceedings. Her Zoom background was a stock image of the Golden Gate Bridge, an odd and distracting choice that felt like an intentional attempt to draw attention to herself. Watching her fumble with her technology was almost pitiable, but it was hard to summon any genuine sympathy given the torment she had caused. The session itself was something of a gong show. She didn't plead guilty or not guilty. Instead, she agreed to certain terms with the understanding that failing to adhere to them would result in another arrest. The specifics were somewhat confusing, but what mattered most to us was that it marked the end of her direct legal entanglement in our lives. The most surreal moment came after the hearing was officially over. The judge instructed everyone to turn off their cameras, and we complied, but she didn't. My husband and I sat, transfixed, as her feed remained live while the judge moved on to other cases. She sat in her chair, staring into the camera as though it were a mirror, then picked up her phone and made a call. What followed was a bizarre display. She began to cry, her face contorted in anguish, but then without warning, she burst into hysterical laughter. Moments later, she was sobbing again, her eyes locking onto the camera as though she knew we were watching. Whether this was intentional or accidental, we'll never know. Was it a plea for sympathy? A calculated move? Or just another layer of her unraveling psyche? The uncertainty was unnerving. One detail remains seared in my memory, though I hesitate to mention it because it ventures into speculative territory. In an earlier post, I described how she once uploaded photos of her dog's excrement with my name written beside it. A friend later pointed out something I hadn't noticed, that the size of the feces didn't seem to match the size of her small dog. The implications of this observation were revolting, and my brain has firmly rejected processing them. I prefer to leave it as an unsolved mystery, one I'm more than happy to never revisit. In the end, karma appears to have caught up with her. We learned through one of her bail variation requests that she now resides in subsidized housing, a far cry from the life of glamour and prestige she once projected. Since her second arrest in 2020, I haven't seen her in person. Occasionally, I receive messages from people who claim to know her, sharing stories of their own run-ins. One person told me their family member had been scammed out of money by her, a pattern that seems consistent with her history.